Now we're going to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of shooting on a digital single lens reflex camera, or DSLR. Now, even if you're not shooting on a DSLR for this class, pay attention to this video. Some of the terminology we're going to use is stuff that you can still adjust or still play around with on a smartphone or on a point and shoot. The technical side of shooting on a DSLR is intimidating for a lot of people. Newcomers will enter photography, they'll get a camera, and they'll notice that there's adjustment wheels that have all sorts of abbreviations and numbers that you can adjust and change, and just get overwhelmed by it, not know what they are and how they work with each other. But I'm here to tell you that if you know 4 basic things about how a DSLR works, and how these 4 things work with each other, not only will it make your photography better, it'll make you feel a whole lot more confident about what you're doing. So let's go over those 4 things today. Now, the first 2 are arguably the most important part of learning how a DSLR works and learning the technical aspects of photography. And they both have to do with the shutter. Now remember, the shutter is the thing in the back of the camera that opens after the mirror flips up when you hit the button telling it to take a picture, and it exposes what used to be the film and now is the computer sensor in the back of the camera. And the first of the 2 that we're going to talk about is called aperture. Now, aperture, you may have heard this terminology kicked around before, but it means something very specific. Aperture is how wide the shutter opens to capture the photograph. So the shutter will swing open when you hit the button in order to expose the sensor to light. Aperture is a measurement of how wide, how big the opening is going to be. Think about it in terms as measurement of size. It is measuring how big the shutter is going to open to. And it's actually measured in terms of restrictions on how wide the hole is going to open. And we call those stops. So when you hear someone talking about an aperture, they'll ask you what your aperture is set at, and what they're asking is what stop it is set at. And that is measured in terms of f. So if you see it written, it will be f/ and then a number, and you can refer to it as f-stop. So if you are explaining to somebody what your aperture is set at, you can say, I'm at f-stop 1.4, for example. And so this is a diagram of how the f-stops work with the size of the shutter opening. The smaller the number, the wider the shutter is going to open each time you hit the button. So an f1.4 means the shutter is going to open incredibly wide. An f16 means that the shutter is only going to open just a little bit. And remember, all of this has to do with light. The wider it opens, so the smaller the f-stop, the more light is going to enter the camera and hit this sensor. The smaller the opening, the less light is going to come in and hit the sensor. You can actually see the difference. If you happen to have an SLR, you can turn the thing around, point it at your face, hit the button, and actually see how far it opens. So if you ever need a good visual representation of what's going on, just point the camera at your face, and then at the end you'll know how aperture works, and you'll also get a funny picture of your face. Now, just to be clear, aperture depends oftentimes now on the lens. Each lens has got a computer setting in it that will let the camera know how far it can open its shutter on a given time. So smaller f-stops, if we're talking about f-stops down in the f2 or f1.4 that open very, very, very wide and are very useful for low light photography, those lenses can be a little bit expensive sometimes. Cheaper lenses won't be able to go down that far for f-stop. But just a key point to remember, f-stop, which is a measurement of aperture, has everything to do with how wide the lens itself opens. One of the tangible differences between a low f-stop and a high f-stop, or low aperture and high aperture, is what happens in the background. when you have a low f-stop, perhaps an aperture or an f-stop of 1.4 or of 2, you are letting in so much light that it actually blurs the background. The focal length of the camera focuses very sharp right on what's in front of it, and everything else gets really blurry. This is based on the angle of the light that's coming in. So on the left here, we have a low f-stop. We have a low aperture. Because of the angle that the light is coming in, the flower petals in the center of the flower are incredibly sharp and detailed, but everything else behind it is blurry. If we notice on the right, which has a higher f-stop, has a higher aperture, the flower itself is still sharp, it's still in focus, but you can make out leaves in the background. You can make out other flowers in the background. Everything is far less blurry. And depending on what you want to do, if you're outside in full light, you can make these adjustments. Sometimes it's nice to have an incredible amount of deep blur so that you're only focusing on what you're looking at. This can help set a sense of depth to show you how deep a scene is, or to give a sense of motion sometimes even. Sometimes if we've got a really great compelling background though, we don't want to have it all blurred out, so we may set our aperture up higher. Now this is, again, assuming you're shooting outside in full light. When you're inside, this will make a big difference on the lightness or darkness. Funny enough, aperture is actually really complicated, despite the fact it seems really simple. It has to do with math, and math is almost always horribly terrifying, based on the geometry of the light that's coming into the lens and how it works with the glass. You can actually sit down with a calculated algorithm and mathematically determine what the f-stop of a lens is going to be based on certain lights. However, I'm not that good at math, and so I just sort of rely on my eyeballs to make this determination. But especially for those of you who are going to be shooting a lot indoors or inside, a really good quick guideline that you have to remember is that a higher aperture, which means that the lens itself, the shutter, is going to open only a tiny little amount. That means it's letting in less light, which means you're going to end up with a darker photo. So let's say that you are tinkering around with your camera and you're shooting inside of a classroom, or you're shooting inside of a Alico arena, which is really bad for this. And you notice that all of your photographs are coming out dark. Play around with the settings on your camera and see if maybe you can set your f-stop, set your aperture lower, so that you can open up the shutter and let more light in. That might help you out a little bit. So this is step one. It's determining what the aperture is. An aperture is how wide the shutter opens. So that leads us to our next of the two shutter dynamics, which is shutter speed. So if aperture is how wide the shutter opens, shutter speed is how fast it opens, or more specifically, how long the shutter opens while taking the photograph. So what is the time frame between open and closed back again? And shutter speed itself is going to be measured in literal speed. Unlike aperture, which is measured in sort of these stops that are mathematically calculated based on geometry, shutter speed is measured in actual literal time. So if your shutter is set to 1/125 as its shutter speed, that is literally 1/125th of a second. That makes measuring the whole thing a little bit easier. And in the same way that we can think about what aperture does to light, we can think about what shutter speed does to light. If a shutter opens very fast and shuts very fast, it is letting in less light than if it opens, stays open for longer, and then shuts. This is a really useful chart for thinking about that. Look at the little stick man and assume that the stick man is in full run. When you're in much faster shutter speeds, like 1/1000, 1/500, 1/125, that's where you're dealing with freezing action. When you take that picture, it's going to look like you're running, your subject who's running, your little stick man, is frozen in the air. That's because the speed in which it is opening and closing is so fast that all of the light is entering the lens in that small period of time. When you start getting into like 1/125 to 1/60, that's where you are still able to hold the camera in your hand without much of a problem. But if you take a picture of someone in full run, they're going to be a little blurry. And that's because their body is actually moving in the space when the camera shutter is open. So shutter opens, their body's still moving a little bit, shutter closes. So you're capturing that motion. And then once you start getting into the really low numbers, anything from the small fractions like 1 over 30 or 1 over 15 to 1/8, a quarter, a half, or even up to the full seconds. So 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, or 8 seconds. That's where the camera shutter is open for so long that any small amount of motion in your hands is going to make the picture look blurry. Because all that light is getting moved around if you move the camera just a little bit as the shutter stays open. So once you get down into that range, you really need to have a monopod or a tripod to keep everything steady. So some examples here. This was a javelin thrower. This is using a very, very high shutter speed, and this is capturing the person frozen in air. So it looks as if they're posing this way, right? It looks like they're barely in motion. Context clues tell us that they are in motion, but there's no blur whatsoever, and that's because it is shot at an incredibly high shutter speed. It's important to note, too, that this does still affect light. This is easier to do in outside in full light than it is indoors. Whereas this is shot on a much slower shutter speed. The shutter itself is staying open longer, and this creates action blur. So the runners themselves look blurry. You can see their feet, and their feet are sort of working in a little circular motion as the lens is open. You can see the Adidas advertisement in the background that has moved while the shutter is open. And all of this blur indicates motion that has occurred while the shutter is open. You can use this effectively sometimes to create good action blur. So another good quick guideline, if we think about what we talked about with aperture. When aperture, higher aperture, which makes the lens shutter open at a smaller size, means that you get a darker photo. And the same way, the higher speed of your shutter means you get a darker photo. If you open the shutter really fast and close it really fast, not a lot of light gets a chance to get in before it closes again, meaning you end up with darker pictures. Now this is a real quandary when you're shooting indoors, because indoors you're going to need to make the shutter speed slower to let in more light, because there's not enough light to go around. But the more you do that, the more risk you run of blurring your photograph. So you just have to adjust it and be careful with what you do. Take lots and lots of pictures and see how they're coming out. And just as an example to see how light interacts with the shutter speed, this is where all of the ISO, more on that in a second, is the same. The aperture is exactly the same with all of the pictures, but just the shutter speed changes. And you can see how the candle goes from being way too dark at 1 over 250 to way too light at half of a second. So you have to adjust your camera, adjust your shutter speed to match the moment you're taking a picture of. Now occasionally you can use intentional blur to make some really cool things happen. You can use really long exposure shots to make something happen that's pretty cool too. So this Ferris wheel is a good example of that. On the left is a 1 over 120, which is a pretty standard medium, it says fast, but that's really more of a medium shutter speed. You can see that there's a little bit of a blur. But if you get a tripod and you point your camera at the Ferris wheel, which has lights on it, and you set it for 4 seconds, the Ferris wheel is going to move and the little lights are going to move during that 4 seconds that the shutter is open. And during that time, you end up with this really amazing light trail. It looks like the light is solidly moving, and that's because the light has moved that distance while the shutter was open. Some photographers have done some really cool things with this, with stuff like rocket launches out on the coast, where NASA launches off now, used to launch space shuttles, now launches rockets into space to carry satellites or to refuel the International Space Station. If you've ever happened to have seen one of these, you know that there's a bright trail of light and fire coming off of them at night. It's a little tiny bit of fire if you just look at it with your eyeballs. But if you point a camera at it and you put a really long exposure shutter speed on it, it will look like this really beautiful glowing trail of fire going up into the sky. It's really amazing. When I first bought a tripod, I actually hiked out in the middle of the night when I lived in Orlando with it attached to my backpack where I had all my camera gear in, out to the interstate where there was an overpass, and I sort of walked up to the overpass and set my camera up on the tripod and pointed it down to traffic, and I took probably 2 hours worth of photographs, long exposure shots down of the traffic on the interstate, and got the headlights and brake lights of the cars going by. It was really fun. Not that I necessarily recommend you hiking out to the interstate at 1 in the morning on your own, but I mean, I did it and it worked out just fine. So all that to say this too, if you are going to want to do long exposure shots like this, you're definitely going to want to get yourself either at least a monopod. On the right here is a monopod. It is a stick that you attach your camera to and help keep it balanced a little bit, or a tripod. Tripods are a little bit heavier, a little bit bulkier. They're a little bit harder to deal with doing photojournalism sometimes. But if you're going to do long exposure shots at night, it's totally worth it. Also, don't pay full price for a tripod. Yard sales and pawn shops are chock full of them. Go buy one for pennies on the dollar. So this has been our part 2 where we've talked about aperture and shutter speed. Come back for part 3 where we're going to talk about white balance and ISO.